Welcome to Who's That Pokémon, the most in-depth Pokémon anime rewatch podcast on the entire internet. If you didn't know, this is a retrospective look back on the Pokémon anime series, episode by episode from the very beginning. This show has been airing for over 20 years now and has over 1,000 episodes, yet it seems to get neglected by Pokémon fans, so I thought it was about time we got a podcast entirely dedicated to it. Today's episode is the 15th episode of the Indigo League series, titled Battle Aboard the Saint Anne. In Japan, the episode was titled Battle on the Saint Anne, so essentially the exact same thing. This episode would also kickstart a 3-episode arc, which was really the very first time they'd ever done something like this. They hadn't really had episodes continue into each other so explicitly. They do kind of have the episodes the first few episodes sort of have that vibe about them, but a lot less so than here. It's much more basically a three-parter. This episode first aired in Japan on July 8, 1997. In America, this episode was actually the first episode to be shown to audiences. It aired as a special preview on September 7, 1998, before airing as part of the show proper on September 27, 1998, I should say. The day after the special airing, they actually had the premiere of the first episode, so the actual series started proper, but yeah, they decided they were going to do a little bit of a sneak peek, and they picked this episode, which I can see why. It's pretty action-packed, shows off Team Rocket, shows off a lot of different Pokemon, so I could see why they chose to pick this to be the sort of introductory episode to fans and try and rile up some hype for the series. But on this day in Pokemon history for the Japanese air date, in 2000, Spell of the Unknown premiered in Japanese theatres, which, in my humble opinion, Spell of the Unknown is the best of the original 3 Pokemon films, of the wide theatrical release animated films. I think I'm pretty down on The Power of One. I think that's actually not a great film. A lot of it has to do with its villain being very, very poorly done. I think even without nostalgia on, Mewtwo Strikes Back is a pretty good film, but I think the pacing's a little bit off, whereas Spell of the Unknown has a really interesting villain, if you want to call Molly a villain, and I think the pacing's really tight. It's just a really great film in general. And on this day in Pokemon history for the American air date, there is nothing of note. So the screenplay for this episode was written by Yukiyoshi Ohashi. This is Ohashi's 3rd episode. He last wrote Bulbasaur and the Hidden Village, and he also wrote The Waterflowers of Vermillion City. So those 2 episodes are actually 2 of my favourite episodes so far of the Indigo League, which it gives me a lot of confidence in Ohashi's writing abilities, and knowing what I know about this arc, just seeing an episode in this arc come up, it gets me excited. But now that I'm revisiting and actually looking at, who were the minds behind the episodes, knowing that Ohashi wrote 2 of the better episodes so far, it really got me hyped to jump into this episode again. We've got quite a few debuts here in this episode. The debuts for the human characters, we've got the Magikarp salesman, who we're going to see actually quite a lot of times throughout the series. I was actually having a look on Bulbapedia before, and I was like, okay, maybe he appears once every generation. I was having a look at it. He's appeared at least a dozen times so far. And fun fact, I think I may have mentioned this once in this show before, but if not, I'll mention it again. Every time the Magikarp salesman makes a major appearance in an episode, so not just as a background character or whatever, Ohashi is the writer, so clearly Ohashi loves the Magikarp salesman. Perhaps more importantly, we get the debut of Giovanni. This is the first time we ever see the head honcho of Team Rocket, and similarly, we also get our first glimpse of Team Rocket grunts. Basically, this episode is the first time we see Team Rocket members that aren't Jesse, James, and Meowth, which is pretty cool. We finally get to see the wider organisation. As for Pokemon debuts, we get the debut of Raticate, which is temporarily Ash's for a moment. We get the debut of Persian, which is Giovanni's, and we also get the debut of Magikarp, which belongs to James. The Who's That Pokemon for this episode is a little bit less obvious than it has been in recent episodes. It's Raticate. So with all of that said, it's time to jump into the episode summary and discussion. After earning the Thunder Badge, Ash and his friends walk across a bridge and spot a luxury cruise ship in the distance. The group takes a closer look at the ship and wants to get on board, but Brock mentions that they can't afford it, so they walk away. However, Jesse and James, disguised as a couple of girls, give them free tickets to participate in a Pokemon trainer party that is going to be held aboard the St. Anne. While Ash and his friends look for the luxury liner, Jesse and James head to a nearby lighthouse to meet up with Meowth. Meowth opens up a call with the boss, and Meowth notices a Persian fondly rubbing its head against the boss. Apparently, it's replaced Meowth due to the group's constant failure. Team Rocket reveals their plan, and that the party is a ruse to allow Team Rocket to steal the attending trainer's Pokémon.
We got a call from the boss. Greetings, sir.
So the team is all there.
Sir! Meow! What's with the Persian? Hey, boss, what about Meowth? Ain't I your favorite anymore?
I'm totally disgusted watching you fail me when I expect total perfection.
So what I was thinking during the opening sort of scene here, mostly because we get a lot of aerial shots of Vermillion City, is that we don't really see a whole lot of Vermillion City. Like, these aerial shots are the most we get of the actual city. We basically see the gym, Pokemon Center, and then this little dock area that they sort of feature here briefly, and that's about it. So you really don't get a feel for what Vermillion City is. The same sort of goes for Cerulean City as well. You get a little bit of a glimpse at Cerulean City, I think, when they first arrive there. And we also get a decent little look around Pewter City, because obviously after Ash loses his first battle, he sort of wanders around the area a little bit. But Vermillion City, we don't really see anything, especially not during the gym battle episode. And yeah, as a whole, I think Kanto does a pretty bad job of showing off gym cities in general. In later seasons, I feel like they do a good job of showing off basically every town they go to. But yeah, here they sort of gloss over them a lot of the time. I really like how mysterious our first look at Giovanni is. They're really building him up as this big bad, and seeing kind of his introduction like this, it makes it all the more annoying that they never do anything with Giovanni. Like, they always have him as this like presence hovering there, looming, implying that at some point there's going to be a big showdown. And I mean, they could have used the first movie as that. They involved him in the first movie, but yeah, for whatever reason, we never got that big payoff. We were supposed to get a big payoff finally in Unova with that two-parter where Team Rocket were going to go up against Team Plasma, and then that horrific earthquake hit Japan. They postponed the episodes because there's going to be aspects of the episode that would sort of be reminiscent of the tragedy that took place. So obviously they thought, you know what, this is probably in poor taste, let's postpone it. And actually recently, thanks to Dogasu on Twitter, he actually posted about they'd kept up the sort of post on their website that they were going to eventually air the episode, and that just got taken down recently, which is quite interesting. Giovanni is actually voiced by Ted Lewis here in the English dub, obviously. We know him as James's original voice up until episode 8 before he left to be in a theatre production and obviously couldn't commit to being a main character in the show. But yeah, he's back here as Giovanni, so it went from one Team Rocket character to another. And in the English dub, Giovanni is the first character actually to regain its original voice actor after the split between 4Kids and TPCI. Craig Blair initially took over as Giovanni's voice in the beginning of Sinnoh, but from The Thief That Keeps on Thieving onwards, Lewis actually jumped back into that role, which is kind of interesting to note. I think it seems rather silly that Meowth is shocked that Giovanni has replaced him with a Persian based on what we sort of know about the trio. They've always been incompetent in the eyes of like everyone at Team Rocket, so having him be like, I was your sort of your right-hand Pokemon is very strange, when I've always got the feeling that Team Rocket, well, the Team Rocket trio have always been hated by everyone else in Team Rocket. I do think it's kind of cool that Giovanni has all these business ventures though. It's never explicitly stated, but like, he's got to clearly be in charge of the St. Anne, and like, obviously we'll see more of his business in Island of the Giant Pokemon. So I do think that's kind of cool that we're seeing like all of these sort of business ventures that he has a hand in. And finally, a little bit of trivia about the Saint Anne. The Saint Anne actually retains its Japanese in the anime, despite being called the SS Anne in the games. This is due to, well, it's speculated to be due to the number of paint edits that would be required to make the change between the names. So they're just like, whatever, we'll keep the Japanese name, it's a lot easier. But actually, fun fact, keeping the Japanese name prevents a future potential mix-up when Richie actually gets on a ship called the SS Anne in the search for the legend. So they unintentionally avoided having some sort of little bit of a confusing mix-up later down the line. So that's a happy coincidence. Ash and his friends board the ship and head into the main ballroom, noticing all the people in Pokemon and the various merchandise for sale. Ash notices a battle between a Starmie and a Raticate that's going on. Raticate uses Super Fang to break Starmie's duel, giving Raticate the win. Ash decides to step forward to challenge the Raticate's trainer, sending Butterfree out. Raticate attacks with Jump Kick, but Butterfree counters with Tackle. Raticate then uses Hyper Fang, though Butterfree uses Stun Spore to paralyze it. Ash prepares to finish the duel, but the gentleman recalls his Raticate and declares it a draw, even though Ash was actually winning. Meanwhile, James walks by the vendors. A salesman calls him over and convinces him to buy a Magikarp, tricking him into thinking that the Pokemon is worth a lot of money.
Finish it, Raticate! Hyper Fang attack!
Butterfree! Stun Spore! Alright, now a whirlwind!
Well, that's enough.
Huh?
Why don't we just call it a draw?
But I was winning.
One thing I noticed that I don't think anyone's picked up on before, to my knowledge, is that when they're walking through the St. Anne for the first time, Ash actually walks past a guy wearing a shirt that is, well, pretty much identical to the one that he wears in Alola. I actually had to do a double take. It's basically identical. It's different in a couple of little minor ways, but yeah, it's pretty much his Alola shirt. I've also got to address the gentleman. That's all he's referred to as for this episode, is just the gentleman that Ash battles, obviously. He's just an extremely weird design. He's got a tuxedo, a top hat, a cane, and then these really out of place, like, sort of glasses. And he also has a curly mustache. It was very, very strange sort of setup. And he's just a strange sort of character. Like, why does he randomly stop the battle? Like, he's getting his ass kicked, and he stops the battle, declares it a draw, which is such a heel thing to do. And it's never really brought up that, like, why are you stopping this battle, you jerk? Like, Ash was clearly going to win, you sore loser. Speaking of the gentleman being a little weird, he orders his Raticate to use Jump Kick in this episode, but that's a move that actually can't be learned by Raticate in the games, so bit of a blunder there. I think that's probably one of the bigger errors that they've made in the anime so far. At one point during the battle, Misty asks Brock, does Ash's Butterfree even stand a chance against that Raticate? And look, no. Not even the slightest. With the benefit of hindsight, we know that Butterfree never wins a battle. It's absolutely useless, essentially, based on its track record. But Brock seems to think it'll do well, so I appreciate Brock having sort of, an optimistic view for Butterfree. As I mentioned, Butterfree robbed of another chance to win a battle. It doesn't win a battle ever in its time with Ash, but it does have two battles that are interrupted, the one with Misty and the one with the gentleman here. And in both cases, Butterfree was going to win that battle. Like, it was well and truly on top. Ash was going to beat Misty, no doubt. And he literally had the gentleman on the ropes here. And both times it was Butterfree, unfortunately, not getting a win. I think it's a little bit weird that James gets suckered in by the idea of becoming rich when he's literally already rich. Like, we know he ran away from his parents, but he's still a rich kid. And if he really did want to be rich that bad, he could crawl back to his parents, or he could even crawl back to his grandparents. Like, he is not someone who would be hard up for cash if he wanted to. So him being sort of seduced by the Magikarp salesman struck me as a little bit weird. Speaking of the Magikarp salesman, he's actually voiced by Eric Stewart. So it's Eric Stewart swindling Eric Stewart here. There's also been two other voice actors who've played him since the split, because obviously Eric Stewart hasn't come back to the show since. I would like to see him come back one day, but I don't think that's very likely. Bill Rogers played him during Sinnoh, and Tom Wayland played him during Unova. So back to the plot here. The ship sails out of Vermillion City as Ash and his friends chow down on the sort of buffet going on the St. Anne. The gentleman comes up to Ash and commends his Butterfree. He proposes a trade between his Raticate and Ash's Butterfree. Ash asks Brock if he should go through it, but Brock is too attracted to the woman next to him to respond, so Ash agrees to go ahead with the trade. They go to a trade machine and Ash acquires Raticate while the man receives Butterfree. Meanwhile, Jessie and Meowth are extremely displeased at James being conned into buying a worthless Pokemon. Misty finds Ash looking out at sea, having second thoughts about the trade and unsure if Butterfree will be well cared for. He mentions that as the trade was happening, he remembered the experiences he had shared with Butterfree. So Ash really does decide to trade his Butterfree far too easily here. He really doesn't even give it a second thought. We don't see him pondering it over. Basically, the man proposes the trade, and then Ash is just like, yeah, sure. I'm also kind of surprised that they never really placed too much emphasis on trading in the early seasons, considering it was such a huge mechanic in the games. Like, particularly back then when you didn't have the internet, so you couldn't like just trade over Wi-Fi. You had to actually physically be like, hey, want to trade? And then you'd connect up your link cables and then you'd trade. It was such a huge mechanic. And honestly, it was one of the big aspects that made Pokemon sort of stand out from the crowd in the 90s, is this social aspect to it. Really sort of ahead of the curve in that sort of way, I guess. So you would have thought that there'd be a bit more presence for like trading Pokemon or trade evolutions. I'm surprised Ash never got a trade evolution. It feels like down the line in later seasons, trading became a bigger emphasis. Like, it just seems like it was sort of neglected in the original series. So Team Rocket's plan goes into motion with the ballroom being locked down and Team Rocket grunts confronting the trainers with vacuum packs to capture their Pokeballs. When one of the grunts walks up to Ash and demands his Pokemon, Ash orders Pikachu to attack the thugs with Thundershock. He spurs the other trainers to fight back and everyone sends out their Pokemon. Ash's Pikachu, Charmander and Bulbasaur, together with Brock's Geodude, join the other Pokemon in stopping the Team Rocket thugs. Ash notices a Butterfree swarm attacking with Stun Spore and decides to summon his Butterfree. However, the Pokeball reveals his Raticate and Misty reminds him that he traded Butterfree away. As he watches, Ash deeply misses his Butterfree, remembering his experiences with it and wanting it back.
Now it's my turn. Go, Butterfree! Eradicate! Huh?
Ash, you traded it, remember?
Oh, yeah. Butterfree.
So just why are Jesse and James leading this operation if Giovanni thinks they're so incompetent? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Like, they've proven that they are no good at what they do, and like, I don't know, why would you trust them to be the head honchos of a pretty big like operation? This is way more complex than anything they've done before. They're literally leading an entire army of Team Rocket grunts to capture a whole ship's worth of Pokemon. Like, it just doesn't make sense. There's also a dude in a crowd shot here that straight up looks like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, which I kind of liked. I really did notice a lot of the other background shenanigans that were happening in this episode. Back to Team Rocket though, did they really think that people would just hand over their Pokemon? Like, the grunts just walk up to the trainers initially and they're like, hand over our Pokemon. They're not even threatening them. They don't even have any Pokemon out. In fact, from memory, I don't think any of the grunts even send out a Pokemon here. I'm pretty sure like the trainers just attack the grunts. So, I mean, yeah, it's just really weird. They don't even threaten trainers. They just expect that the Pokemon to get it hand over. And also, how was Team Rocket planning to get away with all the Pokemon when they were out in the middle of the sea? It's not like they sort of hijacked the ship, like they rolled up in their own boats and then boarded it like pirate style. They traveled out to sea on the St. Anne, and like we don't ever see even remotely any sort of mode of transport to escape. So what were they going to do is like take the Pokemon off them and just be like, okay, we're going to ride the ship until our destination. Like, yeah, just a lot of things about this Team Rocket plan doesn't make any sense. So Ash sends out Pidgeotto to join others in a group gust attack. The Pikachu group uses Thunderbolt to send Team Rocket flying off the ship and foils their scheme once and for all. However, during the battle, the ship has sailed directly into a storm. Strong waves begin to batter the ship. James drops the Pokeball holding Magikarp and begins to run after it. Meanwhile, Ash finds the gentleman and requests that the trade be reversed. The man agrees and they begin to execute a reverse trade. The captain tries to calm the passengers, assuring them that the ship is unsinkable, but after another wave crashes against the ship, he enters a lifeboat. The passengers begin scrambling onto the other lifeboats to evacuate. Misty and Brock find Ash finishing the trade. Ash grabs his Pokeball, but another wave causes him to drop it. Ash then begins running after it and his friends follow.
Hey, where's Ash?
So you want to go back on our trade?
Butterfree was the first Pokemon I ever captured. I worked very hard training and raising it. Please, can I have it back?
You leave me no choice.
I'm sorry.
So I'm going to assume that when the Team Rocket members got blasted off by the trainers on the boat, they just ended up drowning at sea because as I mentioned, they have no means of escape out there, so there's no one sort of able to drive a boat over to them. And yeah, they're just in the middle of the ocean, so good luck trying to survive that. I know in the next episode they sort of hold a funeral for Ash, Misty, Brock, Jesse James, and Meowth because they were unaccounted for when the ship went down. But I think the dozen or so Team Rocket members who definitely drowned at sea, they deserved to be in that sort of funeral as well. Even they were bad guys, but they still died. So in this episode, and also in Bye Bye Butterfree, which we'll get to eventually, they really make it seem like Ash has had so many special memories with his Butterfree, when in reality it's barely been around. The only highlights they're actually able to show here is of it evolving and then it tackling Misty Starmie, which those are literally its only highlights. It evolves in Challenge of the Samurai, I believe, and it does admirably in that episode, and then its battle against Starmie are the only 2 times it's ever done anything notable until it gets, well, kind of traded away here. So, yeah, I really do hate that they try to make it seem like Ash has this big, beautiful relationship with Butterfree. All right, we've also got to address another thing that just doesn't make sense in this episode. Why do they say that the ship is sinking? Like, it just... Oh, geez. So they just encounter a storm, a rough patch of sea, and they're being hit with some big waves, so that's pretty scary. But the ship is not sinking. It hasn't hit anything. There's no leak. The ship is not sinking. In fact, the ship doesn't really kind of like sink at all. It just tips upside down eventually. It is really funny to see the captain acting like a coward and abandoning the ship, but getting into lifeboats in water that is literally rocking a huge cruise ship is just idiotic, especially because the ship is not sinking, as I said. And when they do get into the lifeboats, they literally watch a wave that is bigger than the St. Anne hit the ship. So why on earth would you want to get into a lifeboat in that situation? Even if just a normal size wave comes, it's probably going to fuck up the lifeboats. Yet they're out there with 50-foot waves and they're like, yeah, whatever, I'm going to take my chance in this little rubber dinghy. By this time, most of the passengers have gotten off the ship safely. As Ash grabs Butterfree's Pokeball, the ship rocks again, throwing him and his friends into another room and knocking them out. Likewise, just as James grabs Magikarp's Pokeball, another wave sends Team Rocket flying against the wall. They too are knocked unconscious. The ship then capsizes and goes down, which, important note there, the ship capsizes. It never actually is sinking until it flips upside down, which all the people that said it was sinking have already got the boat off the boat before the ship is flipped over. So it just doesn't make any sense. The captain, watching from his lifeboat, assumes that everyone is safe, not realizing that Ash and his friends and Team Rocket are still trapped on board.
And as the St. Anne heads to the bottom of the sea, our heroes are trapped unconscious inside, and so is Team Rocket. Could this be the end? How will they escape their watery fate? I don't know, but I have a terrible sinking feeling.
So despite my criticisms of the abandoning ship sort of not making any sense, the captain asking if anyone didn't leave the ship safely is a hilarious little moment. But yeah, that's it for this episode. We have a little to be continued, sort of the narrator questioning whether Team Rocket and Ash and his friends are going to survive. But I mean, we'll have to tune in next time to find out. But what did I think of this episode? And look, revisiting it, I actually thought this was just an okay episode. I really wanted to love it because I fondly remember this arc. But yeah, it didn't really live up to those heights. It gets major thumbs up for having an interesting episode premise in general, introducing Giovanni and the rest of Team Rocket, and obviously for being the first time they ever attempted a multi-part arc, it is definitely interesting to watch from that, so it's certainly not a dull or boring episode, that's for sure. However, for the most part, it is a little bit unremarkable. Rewatching it this time was also the first time I ever realised that abandoning ship just didn't make sense. So yeah, that kind of bothered me a fair bit, as well as Team Rocket's just not their plan not really making too much sense in terms of escaping. I'm definitely overthinking a kids show, but I still want my episodes to make sense, even though this is a kids show. Most kids are probably not going to question those sort of things, but still, I do like when you make a kids show, you still make it sort of airtight when it comes to sort of plot and reasoning. I really don't understand why they couldn't have had it actually sink. Like, why couldn't it have hit an iceberg and actually gone down Titanic style? You could have still had it flipped upside down and do the Poseidon adventure parody that they do next episode. You could have literally done both parodies. It would have worked fine, but they didn't for some reason, and it sort of just comes off as lazy and awkward to me. Yeah, it's not a bad episode by any stretch, but definitely not as good as I remembered. So a recap of the major events that happened in this episode. Ash and his friends set off on a cruise aboard this St. Anne luxury liner. Ash trades his Butterfree for a gentleman's Raticate, but later trades back. James buys a Magikarp from the Magikarp salesman, and the St. Anne sinks with Ash, Misty, Brock, and Team Rocket on board. Ash Ketchum's win-loss record is still 3 wins, 3 losses, and he's still on a 1-win streak. I did debate whether to give Ash a win for this battle with the gentleman, because he was winning, and he was literally 1 move away from winning. However, to keep things consistent across all of this tracking that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to rule it null and void because he never officially won the battle. So if I start ruling stuff like this as a victory, then we're going to get into too many grey areas. So for future reference, it's just going to be whether did Ash win or actually lose a proper trainer battle. None of the grey areas are going to count. But now it's time for a couple more bits of trivia. So as I mentioned, this was actually the very first episode shown to American audiences of the Pokemon anime, and when it aired as a sneak peek in the US, it was actually not shown everywhere, so it didn't completely work as a sneak peek. Some areas ran the annual Labor Day Jerry Lewis MDA telethon instead, so depending on where you were located, you either got the telethon or you actually got this sneak peek at Pokemon, which probably did hurt the initial sort of audience it garnered. I mean, it would have missed out on a whole bunch of eyes in those markets that didn't show the sneak peek. Also, while not in the actual episode itself, the preview for this episode from the episode before it actually had Ash directly referring to Giovanni by name, which you're probably wondering why this is significant at all, but that is actually the only instance where one of the protagonists ever uses Giovanni's name, which I find so unbelievable, but it does make sense because they never encounter Giovanni. Literally, that 2-parter that was postponed and then I guess has been lost forever in Unova was the first time Ash was supposed to actually see Giovanni. He doesn't see Giovanni across all of these adventures, so why would he ever mention his name? It's actually really, really cool bit of trivia once you think about it. But with all the trivia out of the way, it's time to ask our question of the week through Pokemail. Now, this episode, I'm asking you guys if you think it would have been interesting if Ash had actually gone through with his trade of Butterfree. As I mentioned earlier on, I think it was definitely a missed opportunity not to feature trades and trade evolutions much sooner than the show did and much more heavily than the show did. I think this could have been a really good opportunity to have Butterfree be traded away for something that was a trade evolution. I think that would have been really cool because Butterfree is sort of expendable. I think it's definitely his most expendable Pokemon at this point in time. Obviously, Pikachu is not going to get traded away. Neither is any of the starters. And I think Pidgeotto is definitely... Look, it doesn't have a whole lot of personality, but it gets used so heavily that it sort of does have a personality in a way, I guess. Whereas you got Butterfree. Butterfree rarely comes out for anything. When it does come out for a trainer battle, it just loses. So I think... Here, but one, trading Butterfree wouldn't have been it wouldn't have been really sort of complained about by fans. They wouldn't have missed Butterfree. And I think it would have been really cool if he traded for a Kadabra and then it evolved to an Alakazam. Maybe he's too early on in his journey to have a fully evolved Pokemon, but that would be pretty cool to have seen happen. But that's about all for this episode. Thanks for listening to Who's That Pokemon. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, pretty much any podcast service around. You can also find the show on Twitter at Who's That PKMM Pod to keep up with the latest updates for the show. And I'm on Twitter as @SauceMarlow. You can also check out my YouTube channel, WTP Productions. There you'll find all sorts of Pokemon content, covering the games, anime, basically everything in between. If it's Pokemon, I'm covering it. But yeah, as I said, that's all for this episode. I hope you join me again next time as I take a look back at Pokemon Shipwreck, the second part in this mini saga.